mental health has to be understood as coupled with spiritual agency. So spiritual health and mental health are not unrelated things.
This is the Into the Light podcast, where we ask experts, hear authors, and listen to stories about pornography, sexuality, and the Christian life. This podcast is part of the teaching documentary, also called Into the Light. I'm your host, John Michael Bout, and I hope that through this conversation, you meet Jesus, find healing, and have your honest questions answered. Hey, this is Jacob. Dr. Pierre is taking chapter 1 of the documentary. He's laying the foundation of understanding pornography, sexual sin, and sin in general, which then is a launch pad for the rest of the film. We recorded this episode on a film trip that we went on for the Into the Light documentary. Since then, we've been able to take classes with him, and I've just really grown in respect for him as a teacher and as a person. Probably my favorite part about this episode is how Dr. Pierre walked through some complex questions about art and literature and how we can have a really healthy view of these forms of media. I really enjoyed how careful he was dealing with this topic. Enough of us talking. Let's get into the podcast. Thank you so much for joining me. This is Jeremy Pierre. Today, we just want to talk about kind of definitions, mental health, and just some practical counseling principles and things. But first, can you just tell people who you are, where you're now teaching, and then we'll get into a bit of your personal story.
Sure thing. Thanks for having me, John Michael.
Yeah.
My name is Jeremy Pierre, and I teach at the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary here in Louisville, Kentucky. And I teach biblical counseling, but also the theological methodology that undergirds and acts as context of it. So a lot of practical theology, basically answering the question, how do we take scripture and apply it to the specifics of human experience? And because we believe God's word is relevant to anything that we experience.
Right. Do you still do personal counseling, or is it full-time teaching at Southern?
I do a lot of personal counseling. Okay. So both at the church and then also folks outside of the church. Oftentimes as an outreach, oftentimes as just Christians struggling with things.
Right. Can you just walk me back, kind of pulling back from where you are now, going early on, just share your testimony, how you became a Christian, growing up a Christian, whatever it was, and just share a little bit of your story, how that connects with where you are now.
Sure. So we often tell our faith journeys in sort of key moments, but there's 1,000 moments that we don't even realize are key that are actually key. So I'm just going to tell you the moments that I'm most aware of as key. Well, one was when I was actually converted. My Sunday school teacher was teaching from Romans 6:23, also 3:23, right? That all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God, and all have sinned and fall short. But the free gift of God is salvation in Jesus Christ. And the Lord just had the scariest teacher in there that morning. I was just scared of this lady. And I think it was effective for me to kind of pay a little bit more attention that morning. And I remember knowing I was a sinner and desperately wanting grace. So since that time, I've walked with the Lord. And I will say one other milestone moment for me happened when I was a teenager. And I heard a sermon that basically said, God has a baseball card for every Christian up in heaven, and it has your picture on the front and your stats on the back. Your stats on how much Bible reading you do, how many people you've saved. This was the language being used. And at the end of that sermon, I was terrified because I knew my stats were not what they should be. And thankfully, I have very wise parents who were able to point me to Titus 3:5, not by works of righteousness, which we've done, but according to his mercy, he saved us. And so that helped me, I think, embrace in a deeper way that was more that responsive to the kind of crisis I was in, that Jesus Christ saves me. I don't save myself. So since that time, the Lord's brought me through a number of different trials and difficulties that have forced me to know him in a deeper way. And I didn't like him at the time, but I thank him for him now.
Right. And you went on to further education, and now you're married. Just walk me generally through that and how you ended up at Southern.
Yeah. So I did an undergraduate at Cedarville University, double majored in English and in history, two high yield majors. Went on to get an MA in history from Cleveland State University. My plan was actually to go get a PhD in literature and then teach at a secular institution as a Christian. But in my MA program, I quickly realized I needed to deepen my theological chops to be able to do that. So I came to Southern Seminary to get an MDiv. And about halfway through that degree, the Lord kind of awoke old desires for pastoral ministry in me. And I kind of switched gears and started pastoral care and counseling, and just really, really saw that as an avenue of carrying scripture into the sort of dark corners of human experience we don't normally talk about. And so I went the route of biblical counseling, got a PhD in it, in systematic theology. And in God's grace, they asked me to teach at Southern when I graduated. And so I've been here ever since.
Very cool. I heard you were a guy who loved good literature. What's your favorite, this is just kind of a fun question, what's your favorite genre to read in there?
Oh man, that's a good one. This is going to sound a little bit monocultural here, but I love American literature. The British stuff, there's a lot of really good stuff that's come out of different parts of Asia. There's some really good African literature. I love sort of mid-19th or mid-20th century American literature. I just love it. John Steinbeck is my favorite author.
Very cool. I also love some of his books.
Yeah.
Do you have a favorite of the books that you've worked on?
That's a good question. I think The Dynamic Heart in Daily Life is kind of my baseline to my thinking. And so a lot of what I've developed comes off of that book. It's a theology of human experience, basically. But the one that was most fun to write was my children's storybook Bible, God with Us, A Journey Home. That was just fun because you could be poetic and creative and talk to kids.
Right. So just kind of pulling more into the topic that we're talking about with pornography, and just kind of still on literature, getting us out of the gate, if you had to recommend one or two books directly to a struggler, what would that be? Just in order to start plugging good resources into people who are struggling, what would be the top one, maybe two books that you would give to someone struggling, and then maybe the top one or two books that you would give to someone who's helping someone struggling?
So I'm going to give an answer to that's sort of directly about the issue of pornography and lust, and then some that are not. I think I'd actually start with Jerry Bridges' The Pursuit of Holiness.
Interesting. Because
it gives a larger framework for what brings about holiness in the Christian life. It is such an excellent book. Brian Chappell's Holiness by Grace is another similar, larger issue book that creates the context for the pursuit of the types of conditions of the heart that make pornography no longer make sense. So I think I start with those larger books. If you have to get issue specific, Deepak Reju and Jonathan Holmes' book on the various rescue plans, those are really good. Sexual Sanity for Men and for Women, those are excellent books. Heath Lambert's Finally Free, excellent book. There's a number of good lust-specific books that can be helpful there.
I want to pull back now and talk a little bit, just kind of starting from the beginning on the conversation of pornography, but just hitting an important question. How can Christians, or people who call themselves Christians, keep acting out with sexual sin and or pornography, but also know the Lord, have a relationship with him? How can that, dichotomy happen? A Christian who's also consistently watching pornography. I just think this is a very real question that comes to mind, especially in the context of all these difficult statistics that come out of how pornography is in the church so much. How do those two things live together, and can you still be a Christian and be struggling with pornography?
Yeah. It's a very good question. You can be a Christian and struggle with pornography. The character of that struggle is very different than someone who's not a Christian. And here's some key differences. A key difference is that there is a love for God that never leaves you, that always is concerned with what he is pleased with and what he thinks, enough to bother you that when you're participating in this, it is displeasing to God. So what I mean by that is, it's not just porn is bad or porn is bad for me. It's, I am distancing myself from God. I am making myself less able to see him for who he is. And that may not be a conscious thought on every use or every stumbling, but part of the narrative of guilt for that is God is displeased with me in some way. I think there's also a rhythm of conviction that leads to fighting, that leads to active participation in the grace that God gives. So when you sit under a sermon, when you read a passage of scripture, when you have a conversation with a Christian friend, there is this attraction that you have towards the idea of purity and righteousness as God defines it. That's not true of an unbeliever. Their whatever attraction they have to being porn free is just basically out of convenience or keeping their spouse from getting too ticked off, or just not being a pervert in some kind of ill-defined framework of their mind. So it's a love for God and it's a continuance in the fight, I think, are two distinctives there.
No, that's helpful. What are some of the warning signs for someone who's like, I don't actually know if I'm saved? And maybe that's just a pressing question. What are some things that I guess you could say to that person, and some warning signs of, you do need to take this seriously?
Yeah. What comes to my mind is, 2 Corinthians 7 does make a distinction between a godly sorrow and a worldly sorrow. What's interesting there is it's not a contrast between a godly sorrow and a worldly being okay with one's sin. It's two forms of sorrow. And what Paul says about a godly sorrow is that it leads somewhere. It's characterized by a zeal. He even uses the word vengeance. He uses the word punishment. Okay? It's not self-flagellation. I got to get good with God by making myself miserable. That's not what he's talking about. What he's talking about is, I am absolutely determined to not give in to this, to not have this characterize me, to not give up. And so again, even there, I got to be careful, because there's seasons of the Christian life where you're so discouraged, you think that you're the asterisk to the list of Christian names. So people can get there. But the point is, do you actually then give up Christ? Do you actually then say, you know what? I'm good with being a slave to this. And if you don't, then I think that's indicator that's a godly sorrow. And if you do, then that's probably an indicator that you don't belong to the Lord. And eventually, so here's the factor people rarely come into play. They're trying to judge it in the moment. And you can't judge it in the moment. You have to judge it over a series of moments that accumulate into a pathway. And I've done enough counseling on this to know that when you're starting out and people are working on that very dilemma, am I saved or am I unsaved? I'll say to them, look, that's a great question to ask. Let's keep looking at scripture. Let's keep looking to Christ, but we're not going to be able to determine that in the short term. God will make it clear in the long term. And in many wonderful situations, maybe most, they continue with Christ, they stumble, they fall, they come back 6 months later and I can't believe how stupid I am, I followed in again, but they're returning. They want Jesus and they're on that pathway. And then others, 6 months, 9 months, years, they finally are like, you know what? This fight's not worth it. I'm not interested in it anymore. And then other areas of their life start to fall apart and crumble. And it's never just about porn. It's always about a halo of other things. And eventually they walk away from the faith.
We've had people ask, like, why is porn desirable? Like, why do Christians, when pretty much everybody unanimously says, like, pornography is wrong.
Yep.
That's against God's design for sexuality. Why pornography is even desirable?
I think that actually is more key of a question than you realize. And one of the main things we do in counseling is for that individual, you have to answer that question. Why is it desirable to you? Because there's a baseline universal reality. It's sexual material. You're a sexual being. So sexual desire is wrapped up in there. That's a baseline that's sort of true by the nature of the material. But there's 1,000 other different types of desire, orbits of desire that get linked up with that and make it so compelling and powerful. And those different orbits of desire could be different from individual to individual. So for instance, porn tells you a story and it draws you into a narrative and it promises you different things. Different types of porn do it, and therefore people get pulled in for different reasons. Sometimes it's intimacy, okay? It's this false version of intimacy. You can belong here. You can be loved here. You can find that sense of belonging, okay? Sometimes it's control. And some of the harder forms of pornography or the more violent forms of pornography is all about the domination of another individual. That's a desire that the sinful human heart can be drawn towards that's sexualized, but it's also bigger than sexuality. And that can, if someone feels kind of like they have no control in their life and they're never respected and never looked to, that can be a particular pit for them. Sometimes it's just sort of pleasure at large, like this just larger concept that life should be more pleasant and good than it is. And I put up with a lot of junk in my life and I deserve some good to counterbalance all of the displeasure, all of the bad. And so it's this dedication to just sort of satisfying this impulse. Last one I'll mention is sometimes it's just a simple desire for ease, to not have such a hard time. Like, it's hard to fight. You want relief. Man, any battle, any task worth taking on is toil and it's wearying. And so instead of spend my Friday resisting all of this temptation, you just kind of give in. The battle's over. Yeah, you'll feel guilty for a while, but at least you have the relief. So all of those things can go into what makes pornography desirable, and identifying those things can really help an individual.
Right. Oh, that's so helpful. I've heard that explained as an analogy of like a river where it's made up of many small streams built up into one big one. How do you help people, I guess, identify what the big streams? There may be many things, but and every story is going to have a different collection of streams. How do you help someone realize and dig into those things?
Great question. You got to know their larger story. It's never just porn. It's always part of a larger story. And so you just ask good questions into what are some of the other ways that they stumble and fall, or what are some of the ways that they feel particularly strong and gifted, and things that excite them in terms of what God's called them to do or roles that they've been given. And oftentimes it's the tail side. A lot of what makes them stumble into pornography is the tail side of a lot of the sort of the head side of the coin of strengths and desires and goodness. And so for instance, like someone who's insanely good at getting stuff done and is like well respected when he walks into a room and is just a leader and is really extroverted. Well, I'm paying attention to how that's all the good stuff that can come from it, but how can that then be part of the bad? How can that be part of the ways he's weak and stumbling into this type of pornography?
Interesting. I've not heard it put on the positive side of that. That's cool. Why don't we just go down to us? This is a really important specific stream.
Yeah.
And just one that we got a lot of questions on, specifically with mental health. So just kind of thinking about the man or woman who is saved, but still struggling. There's so much guilt and shame connected with acting out. And that gets tied up with self-hatred, fear, guilt, confusion, and it's all jumbled up, often restarting that very same cycle again through those things. How does pornography and mental health struggles connect with those things?
That's a great question. Great question. Mental health has to be understood as coupled with spiritual agency. So spiritual health and mental health are not unrelated things. Here's how I think of mental health. It's a term that we use to just simply describe that the brain was designed to function in certain ways that lead to health and proper optimal functioning versus things that are dysfunctional, that trip it up. And so it's just simply recognizing we're embodied beings. So spiritual health lends to mental health, and mental health lends to spiritual health. So here's the term I often use. It's a stewardship. We are stewards of our souls. We are stewards of our bodies, including our brains. And so pornography, as something that falls outside God's good design for embodied beings, embodied souls, physical, spiritual beings, means that participation in it means it's going to have detrimental effects spiritually. It's going to have a detrimental effect physically. And there's lots of good books actually that have been written. One in particular that's coming to my mind, Wired for Intimacy. Very good book that describes even the neurological effects that pornography use, heavy pornography use especially, can have on the brain. And what that means is it's doing something it wasn't designed to do. It's making associations, it's making arousals, it's making all these things in ways that fall outside of a human relationship, which we know from the word to be between a man and a woman in the safety of a covenant marriage, interacting with one another as whole beings. It extracts stuff out and taps into different pleasure activities and centers and things like that throw everything off. And so you often have people describing their experiences like even addictive in nature, or they're fragmented in their way of relating to people. Well, that's a physical reality as well as a spiritual reality. So that's why it's good to, by faith, obey God. It's good to listen to what he says. It's good to find life in what he says is life. And that lends itself to your brain doing what God designed it to do in terms of your determination of it. Obviously, there's things outside of our determination that can affect our brain, and there's disease, and there's injury, and there's many things that kind of fall outside of our control. So I have to put that caveat in there.
Right. I mean, this connects directly into, this is not exactly how the question was put, but just a question that we got, which kind of digs into this, is how should we as Christians be thinking about habitual sexual addiction? For example, as a predisposed mental condition, or just a behavioral problem, or just a heart problem, or something of balance in between. And then are there particular personality traits or behavior types that are more susceptible to that? I just think playing into what you were just saying, how do you think about that?
We always have to think dimensionally about the human experience and not one-dimensionally, multi-dimensionally. So a heart issue or a spiritual issue is always at play, but it's at play with a number of other dimensions and aspects of how God made us. And that's because God's amazing. He's like a genius of you can't even use the term because he's just omnicompetent, omniscient, and his design of us we will never fully understand. And so what it means to be mindful of the limitations of our own knowledge of these things is that we don't set unrealistic expectations that aren't based in reality. And so here's what I mean and don't mean by that. What I don't mean by that is, well, porn's everywhere and it's ubiquitous, so to expect someone to be porn-free is just not realistic. That's a lie from hell, honestly. You can, to use a baseball terminology, you can bat 1,000 on porn, on not giving in to porn use. Like you can't bat 1,000 on lust, right? The temptation but you can bat 1,000 on porn use. And as you then work with the Holy Spirit and cooperate with him on the lust issue, that's actually what ends up being that. So I'm not saying that we try to have realistic expectations like, yeah, it's just going to be a thing. That's not what I'm saying. But what I am saying is this. When one has given oneself over to this habituated practice for sometimes years, sometimes decades, I think for us to expect this spiritual moment where we make a decision and we cross this Rubicon, this river, and we never look back and it's never a struggle ever again, and I never participate in it again, I think sets people up for a lot of frustration and guilt and disappointment. And so I don't think we want to say that. I think instead we want to say, will I fight for faith? Will I trust what God says moment to moment? That includes moments when I succeed and I've said no to that temptation. And oh my gosh, I mean, it's so cool to watch when somebody first says no for the first time. They're like, I did it. This is amazing. And you're like, praise God, trust Jesus, not your strength. And it also applies in moments when you fail. Oh no, I gave in again. The same pattern. You told me that the temptation was going to come. You told me not to give this conditioning behavior. I did it. I gave in. Will you trust Jesus, even in this moment, that he's as generous in his grace as he claims to be? And that grace, this is Titus 2:11, right? The grace of God brings salvation. It forgives us. It also trains us. That means discipline. That means creating an ability we didn't have. It trains us to renounce ungodliness and worldly passions. Do I believe that part of grace? And the answer for a Christian isn't going to be a perfect yes every time, but the overall pathway is, yes, I do believe that. And I'm going to emerge from this. So that pathway can take a long time. That pathway can take a longer time than we want it to take. It doesn't always. I mean, sometimes it's fairly marked, and we don't want to take away from that. But you asked a really good question on how do we acknowledge the complexity of habituation. I think it's setting hope-filled expectations that are nevertheless realistic with a fallen world in which we live.
It sometimes feels like we talk about the transforming power of grace and how, and the trusting both in the victories and in the failures. How should we be thinking then about radical measures? Like even just normal boots on the ground, like, okay, cut off this, do this, things that like the Bible doesn't have a checklist of hit this, hit this.
Yep.
How do we think about those things working in tandem with acknowledging the undergirding and all surroundingness of that, while not treating this almost as a works righteousness thing?
Yes, excellent. Here's how you do it. Those behaviors will reinforce my trust in God or undermine it. That's how you should think about it. Always anchor behaviors to faith. Always anchor behaviors to expressions of whether I trust God or I'm choosing not to. So for instance, when I'm counseling a guy through pornography or a lady, I'm now to the point where in my counseling, if they don't agree in the first couple sessions to make some specific changes behaviorally, I tell them, you're not ready for counseling yet. Because heart change is something that's not brought about by those behavior changes, but those behavior changes are indicative of whether there's a baseline willingness to do it. So for instance, if you're accessing porn on your smartphone, I may not say you must get rid of your smartphone and go to a dumb phone, flip phone or whatever. But I will say, okay, let's look at the pattern here. It happens in your bedroom, it happens at night, and it happens on your smartphone. So here's our first step. Your smartphone never goes in your bedroom now. But I use it as my alarm clock. Go to Walmart, they're $5. Okay, get an alarm clock. Charge it outside in the kitchen or in a common area or something like that. I don't view that as the be all and end all. It's not a biblical law. They're not transgressing the law by taking the smartphone into their bedroom. But these are the little indicators that help us ask the question, do I pursue trusting what God has said with all of my heart, or do I half-heartedly pursue it? And that's what Jesus was getting at when he said, cut off your hand, gouge out your eye if it causes you to stumble. He's not wanting people to literally do that, but he's saying, pursue it as if your life depended on it. That's what he's saying.
So helpful. I'm just thinking, pulling back again to the mental health side, because we kind of delineated down a helpful trail. Could you give some practical advice on how someone who's wrestling with mental health struggles, also wrestling with pornography, can take those beginner steps towards change? And we're talking about some of those. But especially with kind of the question, do I first tackle some of the more mental health struggles, or do I first tackle pornography? Mm-hmm. How do you think about that? How do you counsel someone to begin?
I would counsel someone to begin by first speaking to a trusted Christian brother or sister, preferably one who's trained to some degree in counseling or care or something like that. And if you're not comfortable talking quite yet, just avail yourself of some of the resources that you guys are even doing a good job sort of making sure people are connected with, to start to sort of get yourself convinced that the right thing to do is to live openly, to orient yourself outwardly towards people and their ability to help. You know, mental health issues and spiritual health issues are not solved best alone. God made us for a community. God made us for others to say things that, even if we already know them to be true, to say them, to hear them from someone else reinforces it and wakes us up and expands us from this idiosyncratic cycle that we get into when it's just us fighting. And so that may sound like an odd suggestion to start, but I've noticed that oftentimes that's really a Rubicon people have to cross, is the willingness to kind of ruin their respectability, if you will, in order to get the kind of help that they need. And I don't mean ruin like you're going to somebody who's going to trash you. That's not what I'm implying. I'm just saying we kind of have this false ideal we set up for ourselves as independent beings that can fix our own problems. And God's not interested in helping us keep that erected.
Right. How then would you prep someone who isn't struggling with this to be open to someone coming to them? Just kind of thinking on the other end. We've been mostly talking about someone who is struggling themselves. Mm-hmm. But we also need the people who aren't struggling themselves to be willing to have those conversations and be there to listen. Just what encouragement would you give to them, and practical advice?
So sort of at the larger church level with church leaders, and then at the personal level with friendships and relationships and fellowship. We should be the kind of people that are always talking about our need for grace, our need for the Lord Jesus Christ, and the certainty with which he receives us and empowers us about everything, about how angry you get with your spouse, how deeply anxious you get when you go to work, how whatever it is. And when that's the culture of a friend group, then those conversations can happen. But without that, suddenly it's like, I think you might be looking at porn. Are you looking at porn? And it becomes a conversation that's far more intrusive and confrontational in a way that doesn't put it in the larger context of the universal need for grace.
Right. Not trying to force fake community into the church.
Right.
So now just kind of on transition to some more definitional and practical questions. How would you handle a statement like, some representations of the naked body are forms of art and personal expression and are not harmful to the object of the art or to the viewer? And just maybe broadening that out a little bit. How should Christians be thinking about art and media? What's acceptable, what's not?
I love this question because it's something we should be thinking about constantly. And I'm going to grossly oversimplify things, but I found these to be really helpful categories. You have to think about the purpose of the art form itself, so kind of the arrow coming from the art towards you. And then you have to think of the effect that it has on you as a personal individual. That's kind of like the arrow coming back out. And so here's what I mean by that. There's a lot of movies or paintings or any art form, music, that convey some hard things, some broken things. And sometimes that involves a naked body or whatever it is. What is the purpose and framework of reference being represented in that piece of art? Is it to elicit lust? Is it to convey the beauty of something in a way that makes beautiful or represents as beautiful something God hates, something God calls ugly? Or is it representing it as indeed ugly and awful and harsh? So let me give an obvious example that will then maybe set us up for some less obvious examples, which is the harder part to figure out.
Right.
But an obvious example is if you watch Schindler's List, you're going to see naked bodies. Those naked bodies aren't in any way presented to you in a way that would induce lust or is intended to induce lust. It's supposed to show you the horror of what occurred to the Jewish people at the hands of Nazi Germany in those concentration camps. And so that's an example of, yes, you're seeing nakedness, but the purpose and the framework of those who produced it is actually to move you in a way that shows you the profound depravity that man is capable of, okay? And these are image bearers of God that are being herded like cattle. So that's an example of it, okay? And so just keeping with that same example, the arrow going the other way, the effect it has on you. You have to be mindful and humble and talking constantly to the Spirit about the effect that it's having on you. Because I suppose it is possible that someone could watch Schindler's List and be provoked to lust and, oh, I want to see that because that's the only place I get to see naked bodies. Well, that's a misuse of the art form as conveyed. But nevertheless, it's an indicator that you probably shouldn't be watching Schindler's List, right? If that's something that's doing. But hopefully for most of us, like when we see that, the effect it's having on us is indeed one of horror, one of you're moved again at for compassion for those folks, as well as horror at what we as human beings are capable of. So the framework coming at you of the narrative or whatever it is, and then the effect that it has on you. Pornography, for the other extreme of a simple example, right? Because it's just so obviously wrong. It's created to induce lust and to provoke you to use your sexuality in a way that falls outside of God's design. And the effect it has on you is indeed to do that. I mean, that's what you're watching. So I hope that's a helpful framework to then make the judgment call on maybe less obvious examples, because most of the things that we have to make decisions on in the Christian life fall between pornography and Schindler's List.
Right. No, that's incredibly helpful. Just especially on topics like this where there is not, like you're saying, a Leviticus, whatever, to be like, and you cannot watch exactly this, and then this is exactly acceptable media, right. And then not entirely throw out art.
Right.
So just on the same vein of thought of topics that don't have necessarily an exact clear answer all the time, that are difficult to answer. Mm-hmm. I don't know if you could just speak on masturbation and things like nocturnal emissions that mm-hmm. there's so many real honest questions with, but are not as clear as having a Bible verse that says that's exactly wrong all the time.
Yeah. Well, you said that correctly. There is no Bible verse that directly addresses either masturbation or nocturnal emissions, things like that. And that's not a deficiency with Scripture. It's the way Scripture comes to us is a story that tells us how we then are to understand everything in our experience. So we have to look at what God defines as good, how God designed us to experience sexuality, its purposes and things like that. And so really, I think the best way to answer that question is to kind of zoom out of the specifics and start by acknowledging, what did God design sex for? He designed it to be a means of relating between a husband and a wife in a way that builds the other one up. It certainly gives pleasure, certainly yields, procreative results. We have children through it. There's a number of things we could say in that design purpose, but my point is that design purpose then should be the framework from which we understand all the different aberrations or iterations of what that looks like. And so my main thought on something like masturbation is, you are not using sex, your sexuality, to build your covenant partner up. You're using it for your own pleasure. And I think that's what actually makes it wrong, in addition to the reality that the mind has to go to places that will lust and that will misuse either people you know, or imaginative figures that you contrive in your own mind, or pornographic materials, in order to sort of be the fuel for that sort of sexual experience. And so it just falls outside God's design, I think, at the base level. So with nocturnal emissions, that's sort of a little bit less under the control and determination of someone. So I usually encourage people to not sort of repent of it as a willed sin and feel guilty for it, but just acknowledge, hey, part of human life in a broken world is being broken myself, and my body's going to do things that are natural to it, but that maybe take on a form that has an element of brokenness to it. And I just encourage people, don't get too hung up on it. Instead, spend your efforts positively asking the Lord to help you think rightly about yourself, about your sexuality, about your sexual energies. If you're not married, then keeping it in trust to one day, if the Lord does have marriage for you. Or if you're not married and that's a gift to you and you never plan to be married, then keeping it in trust for Him. If you are married, then what it means to live the kind of life where the sexual interactions are such that it's fulfilling the purposes that God gave it to you. You're building into your spouse. So I always think it's helpful to help people realize there's not a chapter and verse, there's not a rule. This is not the one litmus test of all litmus tests for like true Christian faithfulness, but rather to see it in the overall scope of God's calling and design for us.
To end this off a little bit, I was wondering if you could go into, we've been talking about temptation a lot. And for someone who's in that moment of temptation, just to leave someone with a practical word right now, how should someone respond as they are tempted either to look at pornography or to masturbation or any of these other things in that moment, 5 minutes from then and for the rest of the day? Just really practical, tangible things. How should someone respond?
Yeah. So I'm going to answer your question. The danger of answering your question is I do not want to imply this is the only way to respond, right, or this is your new law, this is your new rule. But here's a tip that I've used often in my care for people, and I find helpful myself, is to speak out loud to God about the temptation that you are presently facing. So here's sort of the theology behind that. We're linguistic beings, meaning we speak. God is a speaking God. He speaks to us in His Word. We speak back to Him in prayer. And words have this way of capturing the essence or the meaning of our experience and stewarding it, taking mastery over it. And so it's effective to say, God, right now, I'm wanting to look at that thumbnail image that just came up, because honestly, that shapely form is really intriguing to me. And then you move on. So that's an acknowledgement of the experience, an identification of the temptation. then that moves on to request. You're just talking out loud to him. Maybe you'll look crazy, but who cares? And then you say, but I know that you tell me that leads to death. That's death. I want life. I want you. Give me the strength to not look at that. Now, what I just said, maybe it sounds super cheesy to people. Maybe that sounds like Sunday school-y to people. But honestly, if that's how you kind of feel about that advice, that might be revealing some pride. And it might be revealing that you think you can kind of handle it on your own and you're too dignified for that. Folks, this Bible is full of example after example after example of a truth we see in multiple places. Where I'm thinking about is James 4, that God opposes the proud, but he gives grace to the humble. And so what you're expressing by verbalizing communication with God in the moment is the humility of recognizing this thing's too strong for me. This is too strong for me. I need someone else to defend me and free me in the moment. And I know my God. You know your God. Like, he doesn't say no to that request. He says yes to that request, right? So that's what I encourage people. In the moment of temptation, you verbalize your dependence on God in acknowledging the temptation and asking for help. Now, then you said, what about 5 minutes after? Now, I'm assuming after a failure, like if one fails, like what do you do 5 minutes after? What you do 5 minutes after is you open your Bible, or you open your memory of the Bible, and you remind yourself who God is towards you. And that is, God loves you despite your sin, through your sin. Jesus is the payment for your sin. And what's that going to feel like to you in that 5 minute after moment is, there's no way I can claim that. I literally just did that. And Satan's like, yep, you're right. You can't claim that. But God wants you to claim that. That's actually humility to claim that in the moment. Because what you're acknowledging is, if this is on me, that's actually who I am. Like, I'm going to continue to fail to do it, but that's not who I am. So you're reminding yourself of that. I would also add this, and again, this isn't a law, but I would determine to tell someone that you are accountable to. Tell them of your stumbling and of your failing. It's kind of a way to lock in, if you will, your determination to live openly. Because Psalm 32 is a great place I take people frequently. It's a contrast between me covering my sin versus God covering my sin. And when we uncover our sin, that is always going to lead to health and joy. When we cover our sin, it's always going to lead to further darkness and misery. And it doesn't mean that if you go to somebody else, you guarantee that, but you do make it far less likely that you can hide.
That's so helpful. If we can just end now with one final closing word of hope, just something that you would want to leave someone with that is hopeful for them caught in pornography.
Absolutely, yeah. I think a word of hope is, I made this verse reference earlier, but Titus 2, verse 11. It says, for the grace of God has appeared, bringing salvation. Okay, so that's the first task it does. That means forgiveness, all the things that we've talked about that is joy. And it does a second function, training us to renounce ungodliness and worldly passions. That means bringing about an ability I didn't have before. So it's almost like coaching. Like a really good coach is going to make somebody who's terrible at baseball at the beginning of the season better at baseball at the end of the season. That is a promised function of the grace that appears out of nowhere in terms of what you caused. God brings it. But maybe the word of hope I want to actually end with specifically is if you keep reading in that. So it brings salvation, it trains us to renounce ungodliness. In this present age. That's how he says, in this present age. That phrase is beautiful because Paul said it about his time, but he said it about this whole epoch of time in which we find ourselves. So, and here's where that's particularly encouraging to us living in the year 2022 with our internet and our smartphones. That phrase still applies. In every age, in every temptation, in every cultural pressure, in every normalized behavior, in anything that comes, as long as Jesus' Spirit fulfills his people in his church, you will have what you need to be able to say no to this and to not be characterized and enslaved by it. That's amazing to think about, because guess what? The technology is only going to get more advanced. We're going to see more VR stuff. We're going to see robots. We're going to see just weird stuff that we think of as sci-fi-ish right now. We're going to see it, because every time there's an advance in technology that can be used for the glory of God, it can be used for the exact opposite. And it's going to be used for the exact opposite frequently. And sometimes it's going to be used for the glory of God. And I just think we need to be encouraged. We don't need to be scared by those things, as if God's power isn't going to be sufficient for what's coming. It's always going to be not just sufficient, but overwhelming. And that should give us hope.
Jeremy, thank you for joining me on this podcast.
Yeah.
Thanks for listening to this podcast conversation. To learn more about the full-length teaching documentary, Into the Light, you can find us on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, and our website at Into the Light Documentary. These are all crowd-funded resources for churches and families like yours. So if you find this content valuable, please consider supporting us at givesendgo.com/intothelight.
We love doing these podcasts because they are honest and meaningful conversations. If you enjoyed this discussion, you may also like my podcast, Chats Under the Sun. I have similar conversations with Christians from all walks of life. You can find Chats Under the Sun on Spotify and wherever else you listen to podcasts. Thanks for listening.